Thank you so much, Gais and Betul. And good afternoon, everyone. It's such a pleasure to be with you today, and I'm excited to have an opportunity to share with you some of the research that is coming from the Diligent Institute. And before I dive into the topic in particular, I want to share with you a little bit about what the Diligent Institute is all about. So the Diligent Institute is the research arm and think tank of Diligent Corporation, and we spend our time looking into topics that are of interest to corporate governance, and in particular of interest to corporate directors. And we try to make sure that the examinations that we do and the research that we conduct has a global perspective. And so we work to gather information from directors around the globe. We spend time speaking with directors in countries all across the world to try to understand some of the issues that are facing them today, and then provide research in reports that you can find for free on our website at diligentinstitute.com. So the information that I'm going to present today in this webinar is from one of our reports from the summer of last year, called The High Cost of Governance Deficits, A Case for Modern Governance. And what we undertook with this report was to try to understand some of the financial ramifications of governance mishaps or governance deficits. We also, kind of understand what are some best practices in governance, right? So what are some of the things that many people agree would be considered good things to have in the boardroom, good structures to have in terms of how boards are composed, and then wanted to really take a look and see, do any of those things have implications for financial performance of companies? And so we undertook this research to try to answer that question. And we started out by trying to determine what would be the right approach. We thought an easy way to do this would be to look at a group of pretty successful companies and see what might make differences. So we reviewed the S&P 500 companies. And then we wanted to take a look at the companies that had very well publicized problems. So we looked specifically at companies that were in the top 20% of the S&P 500, as well as the companies that were in the bottom 20% of the S&P 500. And we wanted to understand, how did governance practices influence whether they were in the top 20% or the bottom 20%. And then for those that had very widely publicized, issues in their companies, particularly those that had some component of a governance deficit. So, for example, there had been some misstep at the board level, or something that the board really should have taken action on and maybe didn't take action quickly enough, or didn't take the right action. We could really clearly tie it back to something that the board either should have done or didn't do. What happened to the company after that incident? So we wanted to review that kind of information and then try to see what we could learn about the impact on financial performance and equity growth for these companies. So we decided to look at a group of 14 very well publicized corporate crises. Why 14? Well, we really wanted to set up some criteria to keep ourselves in the zone of fair research. And so we looked for things that had happened at least 3 years ago. So when we were conducting this research, these would have been incidents that happened at least in 2016 or 2017. They had to be recent enough that they were still relevant, but we wanted them to be at least 3 years ago, so that we had some time after the incident occurred to see the results and see the impact of the incident. We also had to make sure that after the incident, the companies were in fact still in business. And believe it or not, that was a little bit more of a challenge. So there were a number of companies where, there had been, some type of a big issue or some type of a big governance problem, and those companies were actually no longer in existence, at least not in the same form that they had been when the issue happened. Maybe they had, been sort of, reconstructed, or they had gone through a bankruptcy, or they had been, completely dissolved. So we came up with a group of 14 companies that had been on the S&P 500 at the time of the issue. And again, there was plenty of information written about them. So we were not, looking into something that, hadn't been talked about quite extensively in the press. We weren't interested in airing something that wasn't already well known. We just wanted to examine the things that already were very well known. And then we also wanted to have the report include both summary data and case studies. So we tried to provide a balance between really looking at high level numbers and then going deep on a set of companies, just to kind of give some examples. So for today's webinar, what we'll do is share first some of the high-level data, so some of the summary data that we came out with, and then we'll go deep into 4 different companies, each one of the companies in a very different industry with a very different experience, but each one gives you an example of how something that happens at the leadership level of the company can have real ramifications on the equity of the company and on the long-term financial trajectory of the company. So just to start, let me share with you how we came up with the measurements. First of all, we wanted to make sure that we were providing some really fair measurements around governance, and that sounds a lot easier than it really was, because governance means lots of different things to lots of people. There's not really a very well established, agreed upon set of measures for governance, and so we wanted to try to start somewhere where we felt that we would be kind of in a place where most different governing bodies would kind of agree, yes, these are things that are worthwhile to explore. And we wanted to also make sure that these were things that we could in fact measure. So there are lots of other things that people think of as best practices in governance that are much more difficult to measure. And in particular, those would be things like how decisions are made in the boardroom, or specific practices taking place in the boardroom that have to do with interpersonal dynamics or discussion tactics. Those things are much, much, much harder to measure. So we wanted to make sure that the things that we were reviewing, in fact, had objective measures. Things like whether or not the CEO and the chairman are the same person. Things like whether or not there is a risk committee in place, and whatever that risk committee might be called. It could be the audit and risk committee, it could be a cyber risk committee, it could be some other body, but is there in fact a committee that has the ownership of risk for the board? We could also observe things like the board size. We could observe the interlocks between the board members. Again, these are all publicly traded companies, so all of this data is readily available, and available in public disclosures. We could also view average tenure of directors. We could determine, how long had the average director been in place on that board. We could also do some examination of some of the shareholder rights, whether or not there are anti-takeover provisions, golden parachutes, poison pills. We could look at some of the governance provisions. Did they have a staggered board? Do they have terms of office, and are those terms staggered? Do they have limitations or changes of charter? Have they had changes of their bylaws? Is there a supermajority requirement? Those are the kinds of things that are easy to observe, because again, these are all part of annual reports. These are all part of proxy filings. These are things that we can observe. We also then wanted to understand a little bit about corporate compensation, again, with the understanding that these are things we can easily measure, but also that they may have some impact on how some of the decisions played out, particularly in some of the companies that we reviewed. There were actions taken by CEOs that had very big consequences for those companies. And so looking at how the CEOs were compensated, what might have been incentivized, could potentially lead to some useful information. So these were the measures that we reviewed. And then we also took those individual measures, looked at them individually, but then we also created kind of a composite measure so that we could try to get kind of a useful snapshot of how did this set of measures overall impact equity creation for companies as a whole. And so when we look at that composite measure, this is actually what we learned. What we saw was that the companies that had the strongest performance in that composite measure were outperforming those that had poor corporate governance by that composite measure by about 15 percentage points over a 2-year period. Now, while this particular measurement doesn't really look at financial performance, it does look at equity return. So we can't necessarily say that strong corporate governance is 100% causal of, this strong financial performance. We don't really have enough data here to be able to make that argument. But what we can say is that it is very strongly correlated. What you can clearly see is that those that don't have these strong corporate governance measures in place are underperforming those that do. And whether that is just coincidence or whether that is causal is still yet to be, completely determined. But it is interesting to see that it is consistent. And so I think what you can say is either there is something that is happening in the companies that are doing really well that encourages them to maintain strong corporate governance practices, or you can say that companies that have strong corporate governance practices tend to do well financially. Really, either statement could be true. We don't know yet which one causes which, but it is interesting to see that they are so strongly correlated. And I think we do hope to repeat this study again at some point in the future and just see, what the results look like a few years on and see what we can find out. The other thing that was sort of interesting as we went through the report, and you'll see this in much more detail as we get into some of the case studies, is that where we found that 15% percentage, or excuse me, 15 percentage point benefit of corporate governance, of having strong corporate governance practices, that is a very encouraging number. However, it's even more encouraging when you look at it in contrast with the detriment of having poor corporate governance practices. And I'll show you that number as we get into the data a little bit further. But before we do that, I wanted to take a quick pause here and just check in with the audience. We have a quick poll question, and we wanted to find out from you whether or not you've ever experienced any kind of what we would call a governance deficit or a governance shortfall. And it doesn't have to be, a big dramatic thing. It could just be that you've experienced your board members or your senior leaders not really having the right information at the right moment, not being able get information to their hands at exactly the right moment. Or maybe they just don't really have good visibility into the specific areas of risk and opportunity that your company is facing. Or perhaps you've encountered cyber risk that has really, created some problems. And maybe that's something that your leaders are really grappling with. So take a moment and just fill out this poll. And if any one of these has happened for you, just check the little box, and then we'll share these results back with the group, and then we'll continue on with the presentation here in a moment. While we're waiting for people to post their votes here, Kais and Betul, I'd be curious to know if you have any predictions as to which one of these might get the biggest results. Be curious to know which one you think is going to get the highest response rate.
Well, I think being short-sighted could be the one. I mean, not the lack of visibility into key risks and opportunities, I would say.
I think that is by far the hardest one too. I think it can be so challenging, right? Because you never know what's coming up on the horizon. And I think as we go into the case studies, we'll see, examples of 4 companies that definitely had that as a challenge, where something happened they could not have predicted. And yes, I would agree with you, Betul. That would be the one that I would probably have checked as well.
We will see.
We'll see. Yes. Okay, Kais, what do you think? Which one do you think is going to top?
While I agree with both of you on the first point, I think also cyber risk is equally important in today's world. And we've seen situations where cyber threats, where data governance was not put in proper within an organization, could cause serious breaches. And those serious breaches could mean substantial financial damages to and reputational damages to the organization as well.
I absolutely agree with you there. And I don't know if I tend to get a lot of alerts about different cyber events that are happening because of the nature of the work that I do. And I just received one this morning that apparently there were 250 million records exposed at Microsoft in December. And so I agree with you, Kaisen. I think it's just so pervasive. It can happen to any company, even companies with the level of sophisticated security of a company like Microsoft. And so I think it is, I absolutely agree with you. I think it's such a challenge. Well, Daria, I think we probably have the votes in. So why don't we go ahead and share the responses back with everybody on the screen. And so it looks like we are all wrong. So I'm glad that we were not being held to our predictions. But so those of you joining us today in the webinar are really challenged more to get the right information at the right time into leaders' hands. And so it's very interesting to know. I mean, yes, certainly any one of these can be a huge challenge for companies. And then 40% of you agree that the lack of visibility into key risk areas and opportunities is a challenge, and 30% of you agree that the cyber risk is something that you've experienced. So thank you for sharing those results with us. I think it is really fascinating. Every company can find themselves having one of these challenges at any moment. So thank you for sharing that with us. We'll go ahead and hide that poll now and go back into our presentation. So hopefully you're seeing slides again. Just verify for me that you're seeing slides.
Yes.
Perfect, thank you. Okay, Great. Okay, so as I mentioned, we did select this group of 14 companies. So let's start by sharing what the composite measure uncovered for us. So something that was really very eye-opening for us. As we were doing this work, there were a lot of press reports coming out at the time, kind of in the wake of United Airlines, and we'll talk a little bit more about United Airlines here in a moment. United Airlines had a pretty well-publicized incident where they had removed a passenger from a plane, and that incident had been filmed on someone's cell phone, and then that video had gone viral, and it really had a major repercussion on the company, and their stock price went down right away. There were a lot of things happening for the company. But then it seemed like the stock price recovered pretty quickly in the months right after the incident. And so the press kind of made it sound as if, okay, that happened, but it was a short blip, and now everything is back to normal. But when we looked at the companies that were having these kinds of issues, what we learned is that a year after their incidents, as a group, these 14 companies had lost $490 billion US dollars in shareholder value. They were underperforming their industry averages by 35 percentage points on average. It was incredible. And what I think is interesting about that story is that you don't really get that impression. Often what will happen is in the news cycle, we know about what's happening when it's happening, but we don't often know what does the company look like a year later, unless something else comes up, if they're in some sort of a trial, or if one of their executives is having interesting issues, like, for example, sneaking out of a country in a box that you would use for a giant music show. Then we might hear about it. Those are the sorts of things we might hear about. But generally speaking, once an issue happens, we hear about it while it's happening, and then we don't hear about it. And so it was very eye-opening to see that as a group, they really had suffered, and we might not have known that if we didn't really kind of take a look at the data to see what it looked like. So let's start to talk about some of the specific examples. I'm going to start with Kobe Steel. You may be very familiar with Kobe Steel. It's a company that's been around for a very long time. They've been around for over 100 years. They're a supplier of steel. They manufacture cars, planes, trains. They supply the steel that is used to manufacture all of these things. And in September of 2017, there was an external committee review, and they revealed that they had falsified quality data. Now, this wasn't the first time that they had an issue. This was not the first scandal that was associated with Kobe Steel, and in the year leading up to the 2017 revelations, the company's stock had underperformed the industry benchmark by about 14%. However, 1 year after that news was published, they were underperforming the metal sector by 33%. So they had lost $2 billion in shareholder value in that year after the incident was revealed. It turned out that practice had been occurring for decades, and management was aware and involved. And what we really thought might be some of the governance deficits here, by looking at our measure of different governance practices, was that the audit committee was letting this pass. There was a corporate culture issue, and there was obviously a board ethics issue. Someone, really probably did know or should have known that these records were being falsified. So let's take a look at what this looked like from an equity perspective. And you can see, here's their pre-crisis stock performance. It's a little up and down. It's not a clean line here, but you get to September of 2017, and it gets revealed. The stock price plummets. It makes a little bit of a recovery. But then, as you can see, it continues to go up and down and never really fully recover. And you can see this giant gulf between the industry averages, which continue to go up and to the right, even though there's still volatility. I mean, this is the metal sector, this dark gray line. And this is the S&P 500 average, this light gray line. The red line here is Kobe Steel. So you can see that it had a major and dramatic impact on their ability to even reach up to the industry average. So again, what we see in the press more often is we see this news, and then we see this news, that it has plummeted and then it has recovered. And we don't actually see well, it didn't really recover. It didn't really recover the way that it might have looked. And just as I mentioned before, I started to talk a little bit about the United Airlines example. This is an interesting one because this is the kind of thing that I feel is such a hallmark of what we think of as modern governance, right? Modern governance is governing in this time where leaders really do need to have a new set of tools, and they need to have a new way of thinking about risk. They need to have a new way of communicating with one another, because risk can come at you at the speed of a tweet. And this is just something boards have never had to deal with before. It is all brand new. And this reputational damage that happened to United Airlines was significant. So if you're not familiar with what happened, this was in April of 2017. There was a physician who was on a plane. He was boarding the flight. He was on an overbooked flight, and he had an assigned seat on his ticket. He went to go sit in his seat, but there was someone else already. There was another person who was going to board the flight who also had the same assigned seat. And when that person went to board the flight attendant literally physically dragged this doctor off the overbooked flight. There was another passenger adjacent who filmed the entire thing on his phone. That video went viral. It immediately caught into a firestorm on Twitter. The company was then very slow to respond, and really the responses were seen as very insufficient, very insincere. A lot of the responses were, yeah, that can happen. It was just not really a very sufficient response in the eyes of the Twitter community. The internet kind of went wild with this, and there were a number of protests. There were a lot of things that were happening kind of in the Twitter storm. But again, the press sort of looked at this as, well, that was a big brouhaha that happened on Twitter, and then a few months later, the stock price rebounded, so problem solved. But it did precipitate a series of later customer service incidents that caused a lot of additional damage. It sort of uncovered that there was a systemic problem in terms of customer service, and it wasn't just a one-off. It really was something that was happening for United Airlines that really sort of showed a deeper cultural problem. So we point the governance deficits back to corporate culture and crisis response. And let's take a look at what happened with the financial performance here. So again, you can see that, prior to this incident, as with the airline industry, it's been sort of up and down over the last number of months. But you can see the dark gray line here is the industry average. United Airlines was tracking a little bit below the industry average, but then right before the incident, they were kind of right on the industry average. Right after the incident, their stock price took a little dip, but then it actually went up pretty significantly. So again, the media sort of looked away at that point and said, I think the problem is solved here. But then there was this massive plummet, and it's really never recovered. Excuse me for just a moment. Okay, just try not to cough right in your ear. So as a total, they had lost $3.9 billion in shareholder equity over the course of a year after the incident. So they were underperforming the industry average by about 15 percentage points. And so it really did have an impact in terms of the overall equity creation and overall equity of the company. We'll just do one more set of examples. We'll do two more examples for you. There were a group of 8 companies in our group of 14 for whom the incident that we were reviewing had happened 2 years prior. So it was interesting because we were able to look at this group of 14 where the incident had happened, within the past 3 years, and it had been at least a year of data that we could review. But of those 14, 8 of them, the incident had happened at least 2 years prior. So we could really look at 2 years worth of data. What's interesting is for that group of 8, just that group of 8, they had lost $250 billion in US dollars of shareholder value. So just they alone, that little group of 8, had lost $250 billion over the course of that 2-year period, which was pretty amazing. They were also doing even worse than the entire group of 14. They were underperforming their sectors by 45 percentage points on average. So it doesn't get better with time, is sort of the news there. And we'll take a look at a couple of companies here. The first one being Olympus. Sure, probably everybody's familiar with Olympus, the Japanese camera company. They also make quite a bit of medical equipment. And for Olympus, the issue here was financial fraud. In September of 2011, the CEO exposed that there was a long-running loss-hiding operation. This has been going on for a long time. There were a lot of people involved, board members, auditors, high-level employees. It was really throughout the entire company. Lots of people knew about it. Lots of people were involved in it. There was a lot of cover-up activity. The deficits were kind of all across the board, but I think the biggest ones can point back to a very weak audit committee that was just not doing its job, and really very weak board ethics. You know, there was some serious systemic problems happening there. Not terribly surprising. When the incident was revealed, there was a giant plummet in the stock price. There was a little bit of a recovery after September 2011, but as you can see, it really never recovered. They've lost $3.6 billion in their shareholder value. They are performing at a little bit less than 31 percentage points below the industry average. This really did have a major impact on the company. It was interesting to see that they're still in business. They're still, trying to clean things up and keep going. This would have been one of the companies that you might have expected to have gone through some type of a major change. So it was great that we were able to see an example of a company that is still kind of trying to clean up, still kind of trying to go. But you can really see here how this has impacted the company in a really fundamental way. So they're struggling through it. They're really trying to get things back on the right track, but it has certainly not been easy. Certainly not been an easy thing. And then Lululemon is another very different example. Again, this is another one that I would sort of categorize as the kind of thing that we see all the time now in this modern governance world, where once again you've got situation of complaints from customers coming in and what was sort of perceived as some tone deaf responses, and then some just outright offensive responses from the CEO, and just not really, the board paying much attention or the board not taking the right actions. So in this particular example, if you're not familiar with Lululemon, they provide clothing for sports and for yoga. They're known mostly as a clothing company for women, and they make very high quality, kind of workout gear. In February 2013, they recalled about 70% of their yoga pants because they were found to be too sheer. The fabric was found to be too sheer. There were a lot of complaints that were coming from customers that the fabric, which was supposed to be opaque, was actually in fact see-through. And at that point, there were a number of offensive comments made by the CEO and founder, Chip Wilson, about the customers, basically making sort of disparaging remarks about women's bodies and about the kind of customer who should be wearing the pants. So that was really difficult for customers. They were very unhappy about those comments and made it very, very known through social media. And then there were a series of apologies, but the apologies did not go over well. People on social media really kind of took those apologies and got even more angry. And so that just did not go particularly well. What happened there was really kind of an information deficit. It was learned that the information about the recall was not really shared appropriately with the board. There was a very ineffective crisis response. The CEO's behavior was not checked in any way by the board. Whether or not it was a complete corporate culture breakdown is a little bit of a question mark, or whether it was just the board not really reining in the CEO and founder. So, some governance deficits there. You could point it all at the CEO, except that, the board really should be keeping an eye on the CEO, even when the CEO is the founder. Actually, especially when the CEO is the founder, the board really has to play a role of, protecting the company and protecting the company's interests. And that can be challenging, but is extremely important. And we'll just kind of take a quick look here at what happened. So you can see that when the incident was revealed, it was February 2013. Right away, there was a little dip in the stock price. It recovered, but then as things progressed, it got progressively worse. Now they're performing at they've lost about $5.3 billion in shareholder value. They're performing at a little less than 41% below the industry average for their kind of retail. And of course, retail being a business that has been struggling in the US this is not a good time for a retail company that was doing well. I mean, they had been doing quite well to be having these kinds of challenges. So just to kind of recap and summarize, and then I think what we want to do is make sure to open this up for questions. And by the way, if you have questions, the easiest way for you to share your questions with us, on the GoToWebinar control panel, you'll see a question box, and you can type your questions right into that question box. We'll be delighted to answer your questions. You can ask questions of any of us. Just put those right in there, and then we'll take your questions. But I think really the overall summary to kind of take away from this is that, while these individual incidents, you could say, well, our company would not do any of these things, so we're in a good place. The truth is, you don't really always know exactly what might be coming. For example, with United Airlines, you might say, well, that wasn't necessarily something that the board did. That was something that an individual flight attendant did. But it was less about what the flight attendant did or didn't do than it was about the entire sort of culture and structure and systemic nature of why that flight attendant did what she did. She did that because there was a policy by the airline to make sure that flights were allowed to be oversold to the extent that they were being oversold, because there had been decisions made at the top leadership level about how many flights they would run in particular markets and how full they would allow flights to get before they would shut down sales on a particular flight. She also did what she did because there was a policy of how to handle customers in a situation where there were two customers with valid tickets for the same seat. So, when you start to kind of parse how did these things happen, it really does begin to point back up to, well, where did those decisions originate? And they may have had their underpinnings in, was the board really paying attention to the right things? If the board is only looking, for example, at financial performance, and they're not also paying attention to things like corporate culture or the ethics of the company or the company's communication with its customers, or are they doing a good job protecting the reputation of the company? Are they looking at reputational risk and how things like social media can actually damage reputational risk? If they're not paying attention to these things, it can have dire consequences for the company. And all of those kinds of things are relatively new areas for boards. That's why we think of this as modern governance. A lot of this just didn't exist before there was social media, before there was this new era of transparency where really any customer at any time can take a video that can crash your stock price. So it's very, very important that boards are well informed, that boards have access to the right insights, and that they can really keep an eye on the different areas of vulnerability that their companies might be facing, and that they think broadly. It's very, very important these days for boards to be asking lots of questions, which can put the management team in a little bit sometimes of an uncomfortable situation. But it is very, very important because everyone is at stake, the management team included, if something goes very, very wrong. So with that in mind, let's take a pause here and see if we've got some questions. Daria, I'm going to turn it over to you to see if we have some questions coming in from the audience, and we can try to address them.
Thank you, Dottie. It was very insightful, so thank you so much. We will now start the Q&A, and on the background, I will also run the last poll for today, so we would appreciate if you could please participate. So first question, is modern governance only for larger organizations?
Great question. So I would say no. I mean, we've been obviously reviewing the companies on the S&P 500 and looking specifically at public companies on the S&P 500, but that's not because those are the only types of entities that are experiencing modern governance or should have modern governance practices. Simply, we went with that group because it was easy to observe their data, right? Again, we were trying to find companies where we could look at quantifiable objective data and measure it. And so looking at public companies and looking at companies where a lot had been written about them and we had a lot of data to use in the analysis just made that easier. So no, I would say modern governance really is for any type of organization, whether it's public or private, or even whether it's a corporation or a not-for-profit. Modern governance is about the era that we live in. It's about the fact that board members need to have better insights. They need to have better tools. They need to have more cohesive practices that protect the organization, that make sure the organization is creating value, that make sure the organization can be resilient. That's what modern governance is all about. It's not really about the size of the company or what it does for a living. It's much more about this era that we're living in, where things are so volatile, so uncertain, so complex, and board members have to do a little bit of a different job than they did, 10 years ago.
Excellent. Kais, Betul, would you like to add anything?
Thank you. I think it was a really very insightful comment, so I will not add anything. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Same from my side. Thank you.
So the next question is, how can technology help overcome governance deficits?
That's a really important and great question. So, and I would say, technology is not like a magic wand, right? So it's technology in combination with the right practices and the right structures, right? So you kind of need to have all three, but technology can certainly help. The way that I would say technology helps is, so for example, let's take for example, I've been talking about United Airlines, so let's just stay there. Let's say that if your board had at its disposal a dashboard that could show you some of the information that is being said about your company in real time, but not just a news aggregator like a Google Alerts or something like that, but could actually show you a valence score of sort of the positivity or negativity of the things being written about you, and could also maybe give you some indication of the health of the company vis-a-vis these articles that are being written. That kind of analysis is actually very doable with technology. There's a lot of AI-fueled tools. In fact, Diligent has one of them called Diligent Governance Intel that will go out and mine 80,000 sources of news, and in kind of the flash of a millisecond, give you a valence score for what is being said about your company. And that kind of analysis, that kind of intelligence tool can be really a game changer for companies. If they could have seen in the early days how dire this really was, it would have given them a different impression of how they might have needed to respond. And they might have said, let's hold for a second. Let's look at how we're speaking to the customers. Maybe we need to be a bit more authentic. Maybe we need to be a bit more genuine. Maybe we need to say we're sorry. That was one of the things that they were really hammered on in social media, is that they actually just didn't apologize for months. And quite frankly, sometimes, that doesn't often roll easily off the tongue, but sometimes just a simple "we're sorry" goes a long way towards saving your company billions of dollars of equity value. Maybe it's worth it. So, that kind of tool could be extremely helpful to boards, and in particular to risk and audit committees as they're reviewing some of these incidents and trying to decide how big of a problem is this. They might also then have backed that up by saying, okay, let's really get at the underpinnings of why this happened. Is it one bad employee, or was that employee simply doing what that employee was trained to do by our company? And if the latter is true, let's now investigate, why do we train our employees to do such a thing? What's behind all of that? And then sharing with the public, why do we do all of that? I think having technology in place that can help you understand that whole chain of events, kind of share with you, how do we do this? Look out across all of your entities to see where are all the different points of connection. How does this all flow together, and allow you to kind of create that risk map and that risk profile could be extremely valuable to audit committees, to boards, as they make those kinds of decisions. Kais, anything you want to add there? I think you have a much better handle on our governance cloud solutions and specific technologies to apply. So anything you want to add there?
Yeah, for the sake of the example that you have mentioned, that's very comprehensive. I would like to mention, for example, there are situations where companies faces crisis and they need to address this crisis in a very discreet and confidential manner at the speed of light. So having a technology that enables a secured environment for documents to be transmitted and received by boards and reviewed, and then decisions being taken while board members are probably in different continents across the globe, trying to address this situation, having secured communication channels that ensures only privileged people have access to this information, could make a big difference in how an organization can respond in a timely manner to such crisis. So that's another example of how technology could serve proper governance.
That's great. And Daria, I think we have just maybe about 30 seconds left, and I noticed that there was a really great question that came in from the audience here. So if you don't mind, I'm going to just quickly address it, and then we'll wrap up with our final slide here. I am going to just put up the final slide for the benefit of everyone. We'll send you this slide deck, but one of the things that you can do as a follow-up to today's session, we'll make sure to send this to you. You'll see that there's this wonderful little interactive quiz that you can take. If you're curious about some of this and you want to get to know a bit more about it, we'd strongly recommend just taking this short quiz. It'll take you all of 5 minutes. You just basically click on this link, and what it will do is just walk you through a few questions. You can kind of understand a little bit about what's happening at your organization and maybe give you some avenues that you can explore a little bit further. But the question that came in was about, in one of the slides, it was written that performance-based compensation for executives might be good for strong governance, but isn't it true that performance-based approach might make the management a bit short-sighted? That's such a great question. I wish I could get together with the person that asked that question and have a longer chat, because this is such a big and good question. I don't have a very quick and easy answer. Very, very shortly, you're right. Yes, of course, performance-based compensation can be very problematic, or it can also be a remedy to problems. It's really all in how it is handled, and it can be very complex. So what I would say is, if you tie performance-based compensation not just to financial performance of the company, but you also have in there other measures of performance besides just finance. So it's not just about dollars. It could also be other measures, such as, maybe you want to do a customer satisfaction score. Maybe you want to do an employee satisfaction score. Maybe you want to do some type of a measure, doing some type of a 360 evaluation of the executive, and there has to be a certain level of rating on that 360-degree evaluation of the executive. That can be very, very positive, because then you're getting a much more comprehensive view. It's not just measuring with one tool, which is, how well did the company perform? But of course, most compensation packages are tied in some way to the financial health of the company, because you want the executive working very hard on behalf of the shareholders and on behalf of the investors of the company. Of course you do. That's very responsible. So that was a very generalistic answer. I apologize for that. There's so much more to it. But thank you for asking the question, because I saw that and I was like, oh, I want to answer that one. That's a very good question. I think there may have been other questions that came in, and I apologize that we're out of time. I'd be happy to address other questions that came in that we didn't have time for. We can always send a follow-up email with some thoughts. But I'd also like to just encourage you to visit thediligentinstitute.com. You can download the full report, which I promise you has a lot more detail and is interesting. And also, I think you might find some of the footnotes and links that we included in that report helpful to you. If some of this is of interest and you want to share it with your boards, we showed you all of our work, so you might find some of the source material helpful to you. So I would strongly recommend that you do that. If you just go to diligentinstitute.com, you can find it. It's called the Modern Governance Report. And I would encourage you to read it. And thank you so much. I hope that this was helpful.
Thank you, Dottie, and thank you, Kais and Betul. And of course, thank you so much, everyone who joined us today. And have a great day. We'll be in touch.